welcome back, everyone. So let's start with the third and last presentation of this session. So we'll have a presentation from Caroline Jagtenberg, who is currently an assistant professor at the School of Business and Economics at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. So prior to that, she obtained her PhD from CWI in 2017, and then she did a postdoc at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. So her research focuses mainly on the optimization of medical services using stochastic modeling. And she has obtained several grants and prizes, including an NWO Rubicon grant in 2018. So today she will talk about a very critical topic, which is how to maximize the survival chances of cardiac arrest patients. So Caroline, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Celine, for the nice introduction. So indeed, my work will be about how we can model emergency medical services volunteer response. And this is joint work with Shane Henderson from Cornell University, as Peter van den Berg is from Rotterdam School of Management, and Hei-Meng Lee, she's a PhD student of Shane. So about the volunteer response, let me just briefly paint a picture of how the system works. Somewhere, someone suffers from an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. That's what those letters mean, OHCA, if you see them again, out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. Someone calls the call center, emergency call center, where they traditionally decide to dispatch an ambulance. But in most modern countries, they also have a system in place where they can send alerts to volunteers that have signed up with an app. These are volunteers that have had CPR training, and the dispatchers, or at least the system, can see their location and automatically dispatches alerts if the call center operator activates the system. So if they think indeed it's a cardiac arrest and it's not a dangerous situation for volunteers to go to. So we'll be studying these systems. Some of the volunteers that receive an alert, they may go, some may not go, some may not even see the alert. So this brings in extra difficulties in terms of modeling and decision making. Many such systems exist worldwide. At the top here, you see one called Hartslag Nu. That one is nationwide in the Netherlands. It's actually one of the oldest of such systems. So they even operated before smartphones existed. You would get an SMS text message. This one is Good Sam in New Zealand. And I actually spent some time working in New Zealand, as Celine said in the introduction. And there we got in touch with the people who are responsible for this app. So we actually collaborate with them. And here on the right, you see Pulse Point, which is big in the US. So the ultimate goal of all of these systems is to, shorten the time to CPR and ultimately to improve the survival rates of these patients. So I have some research questions for today. The first one is how to quantify the impact of, let's say you have N volunteers in your city. How much are they going to help with survival? This, of course, it depends on how the volunteers are distributed over the city. If they're all in one small area, or are you going to spread them out completely, or is there something better in between that you can do? If you know how to optimally distribute them over the city, then that may guide recruitment efforts. If you're trying to attract new volunteers by giving, for example, more CPR training. Second question has to do with volunteer dispatch. So that's what I mean when the system decides who to send an alert. You might think you could just send everyone an alert and that would be a solution that would help survival a lot, but there's also downsides to that, as we'll see. So the question becomes who to alert and when. So let's start with part one. Quantifying the impact of N volunteers. And when I say quantify the impact, I do not mean retrospectively, because this is done where usually people from the medical field, they take all the data from an app, like response times, and they analyze it. But actually, we find that is not a great approach because the data is pretty sparse. And also, they can't track where the volunteers are at all times. They only observe where they are when they are actually being alerted. That's when they're allowed to store that data in the database. So you don't have that many data points, actually. You might also consider a city where they don't have such an app yet, but they are wondering whether it's worthwhile for them to invest in one. So you'd have to quantify how much is that going to improve survival rates, and then is that justifiable for the investment. So when we think about modeling volunteers, you get a first complication, and I say this, you should probably know that me and my co-authors, we have quite a few years of history between us of investigating ambulance logistics. So our brain is very trained to think about servers or that the people that are coming to the patients are ambulances, but they are so different in their behavior. So usually if you're thinking about an ambulance system, you have about anywhere between 10 and 50 in your city or in your region, and you can decide where you let them stand still and wait for the next incident. Usually you can only decide between a few discrete locations, like a proper ambulance base. We don't just park them anywhere on the side of the road. And also if you dispatch them, they will go. They are paid employees, so you can basically count on them following directions. And now we're thinking about volunteers, and all of those things just don't hold anymore. So you've got easily between 1,000 and 10,000 volunteers in a big city. They move around all the time. You cannot tell them where to go. And even if you do alert them, they may go, they may not go. So we have to think differently. Okay, spoiler, how we're going to do is we're going to model the locations of the available volunteers as a Poisson point process. Having said that, I do want to say I do think it would be a mistake if you model the Poisson point process as having a constant rate throughout the city, because we all know some areas are just more popular for people to either live or to go to. So the rate of the Poisson point process may be different in different parts of the city. And we may even influence that rate through recruitment. Some small justification for this Poisson point process. If you're thinking about a system with n volunteers in total, and we assume that they behave independently of one another, then if you're just thinking about a point on the map, and here you see the patient with the red X in the middle, when that patient calls, you basically see a snapshot of the situation, right? You get to see where the close by volunteers are at that moment. And either they will be within the circle or they won't be within the circle of, let's say, the distance that you're still willing to dispatch in. So this is they all have a small probability of being in the circle. This is a binomial distribution depending on n and this probability p. And a binomial with big N and small p is approximately Poisson. There's some theorem that even says that if each volunteer behaves differently, it's still Poisson. And if they move throughout the city differently, you can still approximate this situation by pretending every volunteer behaves like the average volunteer. And you can show that the error that you're making that way is not too big. So that's
Caroline?
Yes.
Sorry, there's a question from Michelle.
Yes. Should I look in the chat?
One question, Caroline. So if I understand correctly, just to be sure, you look at a sort of snapshot in time, right? So it's a single point in time where you want to answer your question.
This is true when the patient arrives, when the call center receives the call, then you see where the volunteers are. But of course, you're designing a system in which You don't have control over the individuals. So all you have control over are these rates mu, but still you're going to have to live with the fact that when a patient calls, you only observe, a draw from one realization from the Poisson point process.
But of course, if you do that like sequentially in time, there will be like correlations and stuff, but that you ignore for the moment.
So do you mean correlations in the sense that one volunteer is already busy with another patient, so they can't go to the next?
That, but I guess also their positions, right? So the positions of those volunteers.
So the first thing, that whether there's like a queue going on where our volunteers are busy, this is very important when you're modeling ambulances. It happens a lot. For volunteers, not so much, because they receive maybe 3 calls per year.
Okay, yeah.
So that's really not an issue, I think. Yeah. And the fact that where they are is correlated, we don't model that correlation, but if a certain area is more popular for people to go to, then it will have a higher mu.
Yeah, I see.
If that makes sense. Yeah, we chose the mu because it's like a service rate. The patients are the customers and the volunteers are serving them. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that answers my question. This was very helpful.
Good, thanks. So this whole world of cardiac arrest, it all depends on time to CPR. So important. So what we're going to track is these response times. So consider a patient at a location somewhere in your city. Then let R be the random response time of the closest available volunteer. So this concept is somehow important, that you have all these realizations and all you really care about is the first one that's going to arrive. So you can have the probability that the response time exceeds some threshold of t minutes. That is equal to the probability of observing exactly 0 volunteers, available volunteers in your circle of a radius that corresponds to this t minutes of running. From Poisson point theory, we know there's a formula for this. Probability of observing 0 of them is e to the power minus the mu of, well, whatever's in your ball. So this ball, it depends on the location of the volunteer and of the radius. I admit this sounds a little abstract. I mean, it's very general, but if you are willing to assume that the distribution, that the density of volunteers is constant, then the formula actually becomes a little bit more insightful. It's e to the power, and then here you get essentially the expected number of volunteers in the ball. So that's the density times pi times r squared. So there you have the surface area of the ball there, and that equation is if you're willing to assume density of volunteers is constant in the ball. And I think if you're thinking of a small ball, you'd be all right with that assumption. So here I said for some threshold, for any threshold t, this is valid. But the fun thing is that you can imagine concentric circles around the patient, and we can evaluate that formula for any of these circles. So you can actually derive the whole distribution of this closest volunteer. Maybe some of you are now going to think, okay, but not all volunteers that I want to send, they will accept. It's very true. So let's say they accept with a probability alpha, then actually you can just think about the system as through something that's known as thinning within Poisson point processes. Maybe you're familiar with that. Basically, the whole system with any volunteer has a certain rate mu, but then you can just say that there is another system that consists of only accepting volunteers, and it will have a rate that is just multiplied with that alpha. So your mu will be a combination of how many volunteers you have, how many of them would accept, and this nu is then the distribution throughout the city. Let's look at an example where indeed we assume the density is some constant value, and I will plug in some numbers, let's say a walking speed of 6 kilometers an hour, and we'll see what happens to the response time of the closest volunteer. So, for example, if you have on average 10 kilometers within 10 volunteers within a 10-kilometer ball, their response time will look like this. And here, this is under the assumption of running at 6 kilometers an hour and of a 3-minute delay. So that's between the cardiac arrest and the time the volunteer starts running. And you can see how this distribution, it changes as you have fewer volunteers, it flattens out. And then here in the system in New Zealand, they actually cut off at a 1-kilometer ball, which corresponds here to 13 minutes response time. So any of this volunteer mass is not really used. So you can see how this the distribution changes depending on the density. And that means that we can already have our first result without doing any optimization. We're just evaluating these formulas. But you can say, okay, if you want to service your city within, let's say, 8 minutes, and you want to have 70% of your patients reached within 8 minutes by a volunteer, then here you can read off your required volunteer density. So that's 1.53 volunteers per kilometer. I should mention these are available volunteers. So if you think your volunteers are going to say no half the time, you're going to have to multiply this number by 2. Okay, this has been all about response times, which are interesting, but actually the end goal is to improve survival. So we have to know how a certain response time relates to a certain patient survival. And there's many studies have been done in literature, usually retrospective ones, where they fitted the line of a regression with the survival of patients and the response time that they observed. And basically all of them are decreasing over time. I think that's the one thing they have in common. And the models that I'll show you, we can essentially work with any of them. I think in all the numerical work, we used the black line. But then you'd have to find out the survival. You'd have to integrate the response time density to get the probability of survival. So let's extend this to from a homogeneous density that I just showed you results for. Let's say your city is indeed divided in regions. Maybe you're thinking of postal codes. And each region has its own cardiac arrest rate, lambda, that's input. And it also has its own probability of finding a volunteer in the region L. This is not known, but at least you know that they have to sum up to 1. So your volunteer is always going to be somewhere. If you're not happy with that, you can create a dummy region, just like out of city, and they can also be there. And we will assume that at least within a region, so within a postal code, the volunteer density is uniform. That last statement is reasonable if the regions are small enough, I think. We did a case study for Auckland, New Zealand, that's discretized in 287, what they call area units. So here you see it. Here where my mouse is now, there's the water, and this is really the central business district, so where the most people are. And there's about 1.5 million people living in Auckland. Then, if we want to compute the probability that the response time exceeds a certain threshold, we're going to have to take the weighted average over all regions, where the weights are the cardiac arrest rates. And this probability, I fill in this formula that we've seen before, minus pi times the radius squared. And here we see the density of volunteers in that region L. We have good estimates for these values, but we don't really know what the volunteers are doing, either because it's hard to measure or because the system doesn't even exist yet. So we can start by just making some examples. Let's say that these new L's, so where the volunteers are, is proportional to the inhabitants of the location. I think that would be a reasonable first guess. And then we can evaluate this function on the screen here. And it's also transforming response times to survival probabilities is no problem. So let me show you what that looks like. For Auckland, if you're interested in survival, you can see that with 300 volunteers, 3,000 available volunteers in the city, you get a survival of, well, something like 12%, which I admit is not crazy high, but this is just a very deadly disease. I think that's also one of the takeaways from this. You're always going to be talking about small numbers. This is the absolute maximum that you could reach if every volunteer was immediately, like, basically standing next to the patient. That's the highest you could potentially achieve. So we see here that it levels off, but still it's you will have some gain if you're increasing from 3,000 to 4,000 volunteers. This is all under the assumption that volunteers are proportional to inhabitants. But you may want to challenge me on that. You may say that's not the case, or how you don't know that that's the case. And that's fair enough. We don't know the correct. Yes. There a question?
Sorry, just that there's a question here, and I didn't want to let you start.
All good.
Far away. So Yaron has a question.
Yes, I don't want to interrupt, but I'm just, thank you. Really interesting. I'm just wondering, do you take into account the probability that a response will be made? It decreases as n increases, because we all know that in New York City, walk around, people won't even come near you because there's so many people. So wondering about that.
So the N is the number of volunteers.
Yes.
Throughout the city. Typically, they don't know how many other people are signed up to the app. That's what the N would be about.
Exactly. But I would assume that if you're in a big city and you're in New York City right now, and there's 1,000 other volunteers. So if you receive a call and you're in the middle of a business meeting, you say, okay, maybe someone else will receive it. And that decreases.
I see. So no, we only have it as a fixed input parameter. This alpha is the acceptance rate. So it's certainly below 1. It's more on the order of magnitude of 10%, 14% chance someone will accept.
And
so it's quite low.
And decreasing that as a function of n is that?
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. We haven't tried that. We have tried many other varieties of this, which I'll talk about, but this is one that we haven't considered. So thank you for the suggestion.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So we're not really sure what the correct volunteer distribution over the city is. But this raised a new question that we as optimization enthusiasts found very interesting. What would be the best distribution over the city? And this, in a way, it's a bound on what you potentially hope to achieve with n volunteers. And it can also guide recruitment efforts, because you can imagine people recruiting by flyering in a neighborhood or putting up posters or something like that. So it becomes an optimization problem. And this is the objective function that we're trying to optimize. I'm keeping it simple first, not survival yet, but just the probability of exceeding some threshold, which is like the simpler variant of the problem. My cardiac arrest rates are input. The densities, they depend on where the volunteers are, and that is actually what my decision variables are going to be. And this function is convex in its decision variables. Right now, the only constraint that I'm putting there is that they sum up to 1. So we can solve this. We can even show that a certain greedy formulation is optimal. It's not super simple. We still need to think quite a bit about what the formula is that you have to be greedy in, but at least you can solve to optimality without using external solvers, etc. We can also maximize survival. That's a little bit harder, but we could still do it exact up to a step size, if you're happy with that. So let's look at some results. What I liked at first observation, I'm going to show you a small amount of volunteers is at the top, 500, and a large amount of volunteers at the bottom, 5,000. What I really like is that the optimal depends on how many volunteers you have. So here we're talking about late arrivals, so exceeding, I think it was 7 minutes, the threshold that we took here. If you have a lot of volunteers, it's optimal to distribute them almost equally throughout the city. This is almost equally blue everywhere. If you have few volunteers, then it is better to focus on the areas with higher cardiac arrest rates. For survival, if that's what you're interested in, that same conclusion does not completely hold. Yes, it becomes a little bit more spread out at the bottom than it is at the top, but not completely uniform. So for survival, even for large numbers of volunteers, it stays interesting to focus on areas with high cardiac arrest rates. And I mean, if you look at the numerical values of this, you could say exactly how much that deviation should be. Up to now, we have only modeled response by volunteers, but in reality, ambulances also respond. So what I'm going to do to model that appropriately, we need the response time of the ambulance, not a mean, but we need the entire distribution of response times per area unit. So that's quite a lot to ask for. This is not something you can typically find online, but if you're in very good contacts with an ambulance provider, you might have them from historical data, or you could simulate and you would obtain that as well. Okay, and then how to model the survival, because I think intuitively it's pretty clear that if you suffer from cardiac arrest, you would be a lot happier if ambulances arrived than if a volunteer arrived, right? And that is also expressed in the survival functions that they have measured that now depends on two parameters. So the EMS, that's emergency medical services, that's the ambulance response time. And this is the time to CPR. That is, CPR can be provided either by the volunteer or by the ambulance. So it's the minimum of those two arrival times. So you see that the situation already becomes a bit more complex. We have this survival function. We did not come up with this, by the way, it's from literature. And it tells you the probability of survival depending on two things, but one is the minimum of two other things. So we felt like it's already a lot to ask for to optimize this. But actually, when you have this response time distribution of the ambulances as input and this survival function I just showed you, and you know how many volunteers you want to do the calculations for in total, we can still optimize this question, like what is the optimal nu throughout the city? Still convex. And I'll just briefly show you the results. I won't go into them too much. But here you see that these circles with small numbers in them, those are the ambulance bases of Auckland. So that's where response times are going to be short, typically, for the ambulance. And you see that you recruit less around the bases, as you might expect. There's like more white around the bases for 500 volunteers. When we move to 5,000 volunteers, that effect is smaller. Here I still see a bit of white around the base, but here actually there's a lot of blue around the base. So yeah, those first intuition that don't recruit near bases, that only holds for small number of volunteers. So what I've told you so far, it was all inspired by Good Sam New Zealand, but since then it's already been applied to two other applications that was not done by ourselves, but there was other researchers who picked up on our work and said, oh, it might also be relevant for them. There was firefighters in Amsterdam who are thinking about setting up a volunteer network. And there's a Red Cross. I prefer not to disclose which Red Cross it is, but it's a national one that already has trained volunteers. They use them for events like a parade or a festival where they set up a tent and you can go there if you're injured. But now they're saying, we already have this entire base of volunteers. What if we just built the app? Then we have something much more powerful. And how much is it worth to us? Well, that's they were able to get some estimates with our model. Then there are, now that you've heard this story, I can imagine that you have an idea of how to make it more realistic. And I actually came up with 3 things that we believe make it more realistic. Maybe you have even more. So I'm gonna explain what I mean with them. My first idea is, okay, so I calculated some optimal distribution over the city, but that's maybe not even possible to attain because you can recruit someone where they live, but they won't always stay in that area. So, you know, you want more volunteer mass in area 1, but you will inadvertently also get volunteer mass in the other areas where a person that is typically in area 1 sometimes goes to. So you cannot really achieve the optimum that I just have been talking about. This is something that we call profiles. So you have to take as input how people move across the city and acknowledge that you cannot just recruit someone that always stays in one area unit. The other options are quicker, I promise. Option B is that you need to add time blocks because different times have different cardiac arrest rates. Option C is that you need to add time blocks because different times have different acceptance rates, alpha. Or D, maybe you have more ideas. If that's the case, then I would like you to type them in the chat and I can check them all when the presentation is over. I can take them home as inspiration. But here I'd like to ask the host to launch a poll to see which one you feel is most relevant.
Who launched the pool, so I'm not sure, but I can see 7 answers in total, and so far the one that had the largest number of votes is C, time blocks for acceptance rates.
Cool.
Yes.
Nice. That's nice to hear. I will let me first shed some light on which ones are easy and which ones are hard. I think that's interesting too. Thanks for the results. Take a quick screenshot to show my co-authors what people tend to think when they hear this story. So what is the easiest one is B. If the different times have different cardiac arrest rates, then recall this function that we're optimizing. They are actually here just as weights of the sum. Then your lambda would get an index L for location and T for time. And you sum it all over the different time blocks. That doesn't make the problem any harder, to be honest. C, on the other hand, if the different time blocks have different acceptance rates, that behaves differently because your alpha is here in the exponent. So it's very different. And there, the more time blocks you cut your day in, the more difficult the optimization problem is going to be. So the computation times increase for sure. Let's see, then the profiles that people move throughout the city, we modeled that as well. And in the interest of time, I'm going to go to just give you a brief idea of how it's done. We first built an entire matrix that here the lines are the profiles. So I like to think of this is just an example of a profile, but I like to think of it this way. If you recruit someone who has their home address in area 2, then you get a whole array of numbers with the likelihood that you'll actually find them in area 2. So the most mass will be here on the diagonal, but they with some probability will be in other locations as well. We fill this entire matrix with data from statistics NZ that we found good data on where people live and where people work. So we treat the workers as if they're always at work, and we treat the non-workers as if they're always at home. Then you get some proxy for profiles. I'll show you what it looks like. The people living in the CBD, that's right there, they tend to be in the CBD also work in the CBD quite a lot, but so also in these other blue areas. The inverse profile, if you're thinking, where do people come from? If you find a random person in CBD, where do they live? This is your answer. So this is, we spent quite some effort into making this matrix realistic. And then all of a sudden, you can't choose your new completely. You can only choose where to recruit from. That's this X. So let's say you do a door-to-door campaign and you recruit from someone living in a region, that's your X. But then you have to multiply that with your matrix to find out where the volunteers actually end up being. Can we still optimize this new question where the goal is to maximize survival, which is a function of new, and new is a combination of profiles and where you recruited from? Yes, we can still optimize, but it got a lot harder. So none of that greedy stuff is going to work anymore. We needed to use the away-step Frank-Wolf algorithm, which as a downside is a lot slower. But I think it's pretty cool that we are actually still able to compute the optimum, not just with a heuristic or something. So here you see the optimal new for Auckland, where people are recruited with acknowledging that profiles are a thing. You don't recruit from the CBD anymore. because there's a large influx in the CBD from people who live elsewhere. So you still get a decent amount of volunteer mass, in fact, more than you would have liked maybe. So don't recruit at all from CBD and from some other areas that have influx. All right, so we are able to make such calculations. And the other thing about the time blocks, we also do a case study where we split day versus night. Of course, you could do many more time blocks, but I think 2 time blocks serves the point of illustrating how that can be done. So we observe in the data that 70% of the cardiac arrests happens during the day. Alpha is higher during the day. 17% of the people will accept. At daytime, only 8% will accept at nighttime, mostly because they are sleeping and they just don't hear the alert. They turn their sound off. What do we assume on the profiles? Because we want to basically combine all the realistic stuff into one big case study. During the day, all the workers are at work, all the non-workers are at home, and at night, everyone is home. You can comment on it if it's precise enough, but it is some profile at least that differs from day to night. So we do this case study, and well, let me summarize what these values mean. First, the yellow, that is if you distribute everyone uniformly throughout the city. That's not a very good solution in terms of the survival that we see here. The green is if you go proportional to inhabitants. It's better, but still, you see, we can do better. The blue is the optimum solution for profiles. It's the best you can do with this number of volunteers if you believe our profiles are correct. And then there's red. That is if you are able to pinpoint the area of a volunteer. Basically, you recruit someone that never leaves their postal code. If you believe that, then you might think you can actually achieve this red line. But you cannot, because the volunteers will move. So this red line is a sort of mistake that you may be making if you are overly optimistic about where your volunteers are going to be. So actually the blue line is the best you can do, and this difference signals the mistake that you might be making. To give you a feel for how difficult these calculations are, this took 7 minutes to calculate just 1 point on one of these graphs. So the whole graph was like an hour maybe to make. Okay, then I just have a little bit of time left to handle the dispatching problem. I'll move to that now. So dispatching problem is you're given a single cardiac arrest here in the center of the circle. The dispatcher, they know exactly which ambulance they dispatch. So you know, let's say you even know how long they're going to take, because this is pretty accurate to predict. So you know how long the ambulance is going to take, and you can observe all the volunteers around the patient, but you cannot observe which one is going to say yes, which one's going to say no. And the question is, who should be alerted and when? The ultimate goal is maximize survival. But there are 2 things that are holding you back from alerting everyone. The one is that thing we call volunteer fatigue. So that is if they get too many pop-ups on their phone, they might still, if it's the first one, they might still go, and after a while, they will just not go, so that if you alert a lot of this patient, you get a decreased performance for later patients. So there's a trade-off there. What also is known to have a bad effect is if you have multiple volunteers arriving on site and they see each other and they realize after running as fast as they could that they were not needed. So those 2 things are really downsides. And you have to somehow acknowledge that in creating a dispatch policy. So this dispatching strategy, I also keep saying which volunteer to alert and when. Why is this when important? Well, you can just alert everyone at time 0, but you can also have an adaptive strategy where time goes by and you learn more information. Someone sends a reject or someone sends an accept, meaning the volunteers push this button on their phone, and you gain more information, and you can then send out new alerts depending on what you learned. For example, New Zealand's current policy is adaptive. So what they do is they send the 3 closest volunteers an alert at time 0. Then they wait 30 seconds. If someone has accepted, they stop. But if nobody has accepted, they send the next 3 closest volunteers an alert, and they keep going like that. So that's already a cool example why adaptive might be sensible. But you can be even more creative. You can imagine that what your policy is going to be depends on how far away all of these volunteers are. So on the left, you see a realization where there's 6 volunteers and they're pretty close. And here there's 6 volunteers, but they're all pretty far away. And it's possible that the optimal decision is different in these 2 cases. There are some safe assumptions that you can make that make your life easier. One is to never dispatch a volunteer that arrives after the ambulance. And the second one is to only alert the volunteer if all closer volunteers have already been alerted. We have 2 approaches for this, and they are ongoing work. So I cannot really tell you conclusions, but I can briefly shed my light on how I would go about solving them. And maybe you have more ideas. This is an open problem, which is, I think, really cool to work on. So you are most welcome to work on the same problem with your own ideas on how to tackle it. Our first idea is dynamic programming, where the cardiac arrest is registered at the call center at time 0. And you observe all these response times of the volunteers. So we assume that we can really know the deterministic travel times. We model it as a discrete system with time steps of c seconds and a finite horizon. You take rewards that are the survival, that of course depends on the first person that's going to arrive, minus some factor times the number of alerts sent out. This part is like a penalty that reflects that you don't want to send out too many alerts, and you need to somehow weigh that with the survival probability. So you probably need to take a very small multiplicative factor there. And for each volunteer, you keep track of their state, which is either they haven't been alerted or they have been alerted but no response given. They've been alerted and they they accepted, or they have already pushed the reject button. Those are the states for the volunteers. And as we move through time, every time step, an alerted volunteer either accepts or rejects or does nothing with fixed predetermined probability. If you model it like this, automatically you get that the duration until a volunteer answers is memoryless. That may not be what you want, but it is very helpful to solve the DP. And then for action spaces, the action is who you'll alert. We say that we allow multiple volunteers to be alerted at time 0, and then after that, you only allow to alert the next closest, or do nothing. That's also, of course, always an option. We can compute the optimum in this way, but only for really small problem sizes, which I think is typical for dynamic programming. So if we took time steps of 5 seconds and just for 5 volunteers, it already took 15 seconds to solve. And that is for one realization, right? Where you see the volunteers on the map. So to train what you should do in any situation, you need to do this many, many times. And the 15 seconds are actually, well, I don't love it, how fast it is with even the small input numbers. The other approach is a machine learning approach, which was a student project. So this is Oceaan. She is a master's student of mine. And she just finished her thesis about this, where our idea was different. The DP really gets to make a lot of decisions at a lot of time steps. This is kind of the opposite, where you say, okay, I'm going to predefine a set of strategies that I think are sensible, and I'm going to let a machine learning algorithm learn which one to use depending on the realization of the volunteer locations. And this predefined set makes it easier. It's just a finite set of strategies. For example, send the closest n volunteers at time 0, or send the closest n volunteers at time 0 and then alert the next closest volunteer every t seconds. So that's a bit like what they do in New Zealand. And then we evaluate all of these strategies by simulation. We use real data for the simulation. It's reasonably realistic what would happen. And we estimate a few performance indicators. such as probability of survival, or probability that more than one volunteer arrives on site, which you want to stay below a bound. And then you get, as a result, you train a decision tree that tells you in each situation what your policy should look like. Let me just not go into why this is the optimal policy, because I think this work can still be improved, but I want you to get a feel for how to read such a tree. Here, the first decision depends on, is the fourth volunteer closer than 6.1 minutes from the patient? If yes, then you're going to use an adaptive strategy that starts with 2 alerts and then every half minute send another one. If the fourth volunteer is further away than 6.1 minutes, then it's going to depend on where the third volunteer is, etc. So different realizations are going to end up in different buckets here, different leaves with different optimal strategy. And we envision that you can bring such a tree to an app manager and discuss the sensibility of it and how likely it is to be implemented. But then even if the computations to create such a tree take quite some time, if you imagine this being used in an actual app where it's automatically decided who gets the alerts, then of course it will be quite quick, because it would just have to evaluate these decisions, whether or not the end volunteer is further than a certain distance away. So as I said, this is ongoing work. Oceane's thesis is finished. So if you'd like to read it, you can let me know and I'm happy to send it to you. But we are still working on improving this even more to prepare a journal article by creating even more strategies as input and having more clever performance indicators. But the general technique, I think, can stay the same. So to wrap this up, if you're interested, some of this work has been published on a preprint server. That's the first part of my talk, with the Poisson point process. Dispatch question has been published in the Queuing Systems Special Edition. That's just a short paper that basically phrases the question. It doesn't tell you how to answer it. It's like an open problem that we suggest to work on. So by that, I'd like to finish my talk. Thank you for your attention.